Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for letting me come speak to you. And I'll say a little bit about my experience. It has been almost exclusively in inspection, forensics. I'm a materials engineer by degree, actually, not a civil or structural engineer. So as one of my great mentors early in my career said, everything's made out of materials. Most of the time we understand the properties, but usually we try to do things that they're not capable of doing. And then also I do expert witness work in the construction defect field. And I think that really helps inform, how we end up in some of the places we're in. When you see kind of reverse engineer the process, right, of how buildings get constructed and where some of those errors are. And so a lot of my presentation is actually giving more about questions than answers, because this is a kind of a complex field. So, doing, what's commonly referred to as the 40-year inspection, there's just challenges all over the place. Because first of all, we have this diverse group of structures, right, that we're trying to look at. We have low rise, high rise, concrete, steel, wood, or, the most traditional framing systems that we have to deal with. Each one of those has its own paradigm. Obviously, we're here talking about concrete, at this convention, but there's, issues related to steel, there's issues related to wood. And then we've got a whole new genre of building envelope, right, and how we protect those structures from the weather and the environment that's around them. I'm doing a lot of work in that area right now, as a matter of fact. And so each one of those drives the scope of that inspection. So you could actually have to have a different, a focus, a different set of criteria for each one of those. The other factor we have is the ownership structure. Owner-occupied residential structures present some special client, if you're the engineer doing the inspection, and liability challenges. I'll touch on those a little bit as well. And I think each of those raises some kind of important questions related to how we go about this process. So the first thing is, what's the standard of care? We talk a lot about that in the engineering field, right? It's what the normal person does that regularly practices in that field, in the same place, at the same time. So really, one of the ways it was explained to me one time was that, if you put 10 engineers in a room, if 6 or 7 of them agreed, you're pretty much in the standard of care. There's going to be outliers, right? Because people have different opinions, and it's not a perfect, we practice engineering, constantly moving towards getting it right. So the first thing is, should visual only be the standard? How much can you tell about certain structures from a visual assessment? Now, I can tell you, I've met some very talented engineers with a lot of experience, and they will look at a structure and they'll have almost X-ray vision, right? They'll know where the crack's going to be. They know where the stress is going to be. They'll walk right up to it just because they've seen enough of these buildings go up. Now, the problem is, of course, that's very unique to that person and their experience base. So how do you export that, talking about the education piece of this, to where we can get 6 or 7 out of 10, or more likely 9 out of 10 engineers doing it the same way, or architects doing it the same way, and coming out with a reproducible result that gets us to where we want to be in the quality of those inspections. So then the second question becomes, when should non-destructive or destructive testing be performed? So you can look at it, but when are you going to have to do a little bit deeper dive? And I've got excerpts there on the top right from the Miami-Dade Code. And I've highlighted the fact that they've got some new standards coming out for 2022 in relation to, in response to some of the recent events. And they have come a long way. When I first started looking at 40-year re-inspections in Miami-Dade County, they had a certification form with a very broadly worded statement by the engineer at the bottom, and it was 1 page. So they told the engineer, good luck. Right? There's a big tall building, go inspect it and sign your life away at the bottom, right? And so we were like, I don't know if I really want to do those, or real life experience. We looked at a building, wasn't particularly complicated, but Miami-Dade has some extra window dressing. They make you do electrical and guardrails and parking lot lighting, and they got this whole little laundry list of things you got to do. So round numbers, we're like close to $30,000, right, to do this inspection. And so they said, thank you very much for the proposal, but we found another local engineer who's going to do it for $5,600. Okay. Not exactly sure the level of detail that would occur with that. No, not casting any aspersions on the other engineers, but there was a cadre of engineers doing 40-year inspections in that marketplace, and they were, very, very competitive, politely on fee. And so one of the things we said was, there's just the risk reward is just not there for us to bring our expertise to bear. Now, when you read into these new documents, now they're pages and pages and pages long, right? Not just the one-page certification form. And they've actually got some narrative that says visual will probably be enough. There's a lot of, mealy-mouthed language in it. But you might want to do some manual inspection, which they further define as chipping away, something you could do with your hand, no special tools, no chipping hammers, no cores, no NDT. But basically, you want to break some stuff off so you can see what it looks like underneath. And that you should do it, you should minimize that, and you should only do it where nobody can see it, and try to keep it to a minimum as a part of the process. So they don't endorse that, but at least they recognize the need for that level. And then they give a little bit of lip service to going even deeper than that. But the performance-based language says that if you see distress, that should be further investigated. So that's where it becomes a very wide open thing, right, as to how much you can understand about that particular structure without doing certain things. Question came up too about design. So I used this line in our prep session, is that there was an old saying that said, anybody can build a building that will stand up. It takes an engineer to design one that will barely stand up, right? Because we have budget pressures, right? We don't have an infinite amount of money to make it however we wanted. And so there's value engineering that goes in, and that's a very real process. And there's certainly nothing wrong with it as long as we don't get below some of those ratios that he talked about. The other complicating feature, it doesn't actually affect the 40 and 50-year-old buildings as much. We were still in a design, bid, build delivery model back then. Design build was a fairly new thing that was, being figured out. Now it's all over the place. Construction management, performance contracting, public-private partnerships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what that means is the traditional roles of an engineer being that solely responsible person, not company, for the protecting the health and safety of the public, and that design can get corrupted in the process. Because now you have system suppliers who have disproportionate roles, in what systems and materials get used. You have construction management and program management consultants who will say, that's a really great idea, but we can't afford it, so we're going to go a different direction. And if you don't want to play along, then you don't get to be the engineer on the job. And so that puts an unusual stress on some of the decision making. So I'm actually a little more worried, quite frankly, going forward than I am going back, because one of the other things we talked about this as well is, and it was great when you talked about doing it by hand, right? Well, we did everything by hand 40 and 50 years ago, right? Big ledgers of calculations. So you could only do so many. I mean, if you had a lot of staff or, interns, you could grind, on a particularly well-funded project like a nuclear plant or something like that. Yeah, there'd be a ton of calculations. But in the day-to-day for a lot of these buildings, what they would do is they would pretty much identify the worst case, right, and extrapolate that to the rest of the building. So in a lot of ways, huge portions of older structures are actually over-designed, just because we didn't have enough time to rationally analyze it down the way we do now for budget purposes, because we have access to these big, robust computer models. We do that in my firm does that actually for people on foundations to try to, and sometimes it's $1 million in savings. Nothing wrong with that, right? Because we've proven that it'll work, but a little bit different situation with the buildings are there. But that brings us to the question, when might we have to go back to the original design and question it? Right now, very good point, right? All of us that have been around a little bit longer and have, younger engineers will ask me, how do you know that? It just doesn't feel right. When I look at it, the proportions of it, experience and that sort of thing, I think a lot of these structures we're not going to understand if they don't feel right. But if they don't feel right, if the distress is in the right places, then we're going to have to dig back in. And to your point, we actually, and it's possible to do, you can actually verify the steel placement, cover, bar size, frequency to see what actually happened on the job. And then, with very talented engineers, you can go back, reverse engineer it and actually see if it's got enough capacity. We've had to do that on brand new structures where there were errors or inspections didn't occur and that sort of thing. So the technology exists, the expertise exists. It's just whether we're willing to fund it. And I mentioned, this is a little Florida centric, but every part of the country becomes a test bed, right? Sometimes for moving the industry forward in the same way that California is the epicenter, pun intended, of your, seismic design, right? Because they have to deal with it every day. And what they went through, what they do to their buildings now gets exported to the rest of the country, even though in the Southeast, if we do get an earthquake, it's all over. We can't design around an earthquake in the Southeast. But the point is, Florida is a really interesting test bed because we have this very challenging environment, weatherization issues. We have this very challenging wind environment for main wind force resisting structures. We've actually been able to get out in front of some of that with some code and inspection criteria. In practice, we have a threshold inspection law in Florida where we inspect buildings because of past collapses. And I'll say one of the interesting things about that process, and I think it plays into where we go with this, is that it was in reaction to catastrophic collapse. The Kansas City hotel and then a collapse here in Florida happened in short order. So we said, listen, we want to have an independent engineer inspect key structural components as designated by the structural engineer, and they're on threshold buildings, big stuff where a lot of people are. And we have not really had, that I'm aware of, a post-occupancy collapse since that procedure went into place. We have had collapses during construction because the role of that inspector during shoring has not been well defined, but we have not, it appears to have worked. Now, I'm going to jinx us, but the point is, I think we're doing a better job of making sure that the important stuff gets built according to plan. So again, maybe what Miami-Dade is jumping through the hoops to respond to their situation can become a model for how we move forward. I'll talk about another possible model as well.
Ryan,
yeah.
Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Can you maybe everybody has better eyes than I do.
Yes.
What does it say here that's highlighted?
It says new forms to be used on recertifications for 2022 onward. So they had a previous improved set of guidelines and templates that they are superseding with this new set. And this new set in the red box is directly in response to the issue that happened down there. So they put a lot of effort into it. And like I said, the page count and the word count and the specificity has improved. It's not perfect, but they've come a long way from those single form 10 or 15 years ago to now they've actually got guidelines and templates. Now, if you go into, this is Broward County, who also has the same exact process, but when you read their standards, it's a list of headers. Foundation, piers, it doesn't say how to do them. It just says these are the list of things you have to look at. So Miami-Dade's getting into the sausage making of what you're supposed to actually do. So that's why I just threw that out there as kind of a food for thought. So one of the ideas I had was, and we've been doing some bridge inspections, that's kind of why I kind of put two and two together, was maybe we could do a rating system like we have for bridges. Because when you think about it, bridges are a really interesting group of structures in that, yeah, they're all, stuff goes over them and they span some, thing, right, from two places, but they're made out of different stuff, right? They're made out of concrete, they're made out of steel, or even made out of wood, usually on the smaller scale. But, and we've got rating systems where we've been able to codify and organize the crime of inspecting those structures and actually putting a heat map on them, right? A color map of red, green, yellow that's going to be able to tell the affected parties you do or you don't have a problem. And then, here's what's going to happen, where are we at in terms of the repair of those structures? So maybe not the actual process itself, or the actual specifics, but maybe we could overlay some of the things that Miami-Dade's doing with a more organized process to help all the engineers doing these things. Because the other thing is bridges happen everywhere, right? Seattle, Miami, Maine, San Diego. So in the same way that, the special things we have in Florida, maybe that's the way we export it on a national level to look at buildings of age. And the other thing is, maybe that uniformity in that standard setting could then attract more qualified engineers to the process, drive more demand for education, improve the herd, right, of folks that are doing these sorts of things, which I think is ultimately where we need to go as well. So this is a little, I don't know how many people are outside of Florida, but I'm going to talk a little bit about Florida specific stuff, but I think it points out an important issue as it relates to owner occupied buildings. So we had a decision before called Morancis, but this one was called Witt versus Lagorce, and it goes back a little over 10 years or so. And what happened in that particular case was a professional geologist did a stormwater design for a residential community. And when that stormwater design failed, and it was determined to be a design error issue. Now, he worked for the developer. He had a contract with the developer. He did all his work for the developer. He was sued by all the individual homeowners who he did not have a contract with. And the court, went all the way to the Florida Supreme Court. They awarded a $4 million judgment against him personally, not his company. He worked for a company that worked for the company that developed it, but he ended up having a personal liability of $4 million because of that design error. That earthquake probably understates the chilling effect that had on practicing engineering, because the other thing is it was clearly exportable to professional engineers and architects. So one of the things that happened in Florida was there was a legislative relief that was passed under FS 558.0035. And what it says is, well, under these rules of engagement, a third party that not in privity with the professional can't sue with unlimited liability the individual professional. But you have to carry professional liability insurance. You have to have it's got a big, bold text that has to go into your contract. And as long as you follow all those processes, the individual engineers and architects and geologists can practice without fear of losing everything as a part of the practice of their business. Now, do we want to avoid personal responsibility? Absolutely not. But if you're looking at catastrophic liability every time you sign, a $4,000, a $5,000, or a $10,000 job, that's not really a very good business model. And so it has helped control that situation to where there is now a viable group of engineers and architects and geologists that will actually work on owner-occupied projects. Because for a while there, they were saying, that's it. Somebody wants to build a condo, wants to build a residential subdivision. I don't know who you're going to find to design it, because I don't want to put, my livelihood, my future at risk for that. So the same thing kind of applies potentially, because the way it's worded, I'll leave it up to the lawyers to debate that, but I don't think it would really apply to a 40-year inspection. So I think one of the things we might need to do, along with creating some rules of the game for the technical aspects of the inspection, we might need to create some rules of the game as it relates to owner occupied for how liability flows in a similar fashion. Contract has the disclaimers, people have to carry, appropriate levels of professional liability and all that sort of thing. And certainly if there's gross negligence, everything's out the door. But if they practice within the standard of care, that it's not a catastrophic situation for the individual. Businesses can sort it out. That's what they do. But I think that's going to be an important thing going forward, because as the consequences of the past recent history start to, become real, we're going to have those questions come up. So the other thing is with owner occupied is there's an internal leadership, right? And their boards typically made up of the owners that live in the building. So they may be engineers or architects as their day job, but their side job is they're helping run the building they live in, right? They're not professional managers. There's politics, right? Well, this faction hates that faction, and that board president's getting deposed in the next vote, and it gets very drama filled because it's their house and it's super important to them. It's my house, it's super important to me too. And then funding issues. The vast majority of HOAs are woefully underfunded for even basic maintenance and renewal, as opposed to something major that might come up down the road. So then how do they react once they know they have a problem? Now, I can tell you that there were discussions 2 firms ago where if you found something That became a private conversation with the HOA's lawyer. It was not something that went to the authority having jurisdiction, because they knew once that was out, that would trigger the AHJ requiring certain repairs or potentially, moving out of the building or all these other draconian things to happen. And they wanted to be able to manage that process and that flow of information. Who wants to put an engineer in that position, right? But that's what happened. So should there be some mandatory timeframes for reporting the inspection findings of concern as the inspector to the owner or the HOA of the building? Because commercial buildings are no different, right? So, can you sit on a report for 6 months because you're really busy when there's a finding that's like super important? No. But how long is too long? Or again, at what point does the severity of the issue kick up to where I think I need to tell the AHJ? There was another building in South Florida not long after the issue in South Florida, the recent one, where they were in the midst of working through major problems on a concrete structure. And it was HOA had no money. The engineer's still trying to get funded enough to figure out how bad it is. All that's going on. And then this other thing happens. And so the engineer finally said, hey, I love you guys. You're a great client, but I got to call the building department. I got to tell them what we're dealing with here. And they were on it, strike team from the HJ showed up, inspected, they red tagged parts of the building and did all this other stuff as a part of their action. And fortunately, it's a collaborative process. They're going to work through because they don't want to, displace all those people in their homes, but they want to make sure that it's safe. So that's a common problem. So, and is there a bona fide need for an extension? Maybe the engineer says this is not immediately critical, threatening to health and safety of the public, so therefore it can remain occupied while we sort this out. And so you can get extensions on till the funding can be raised or whatever. So a little bit less of an issue with commercial buildings, just because they have sometimes access to other types of funding. Loans can be taken out, secured by the property. They may have parent groups that have adequate funding to execute those fixes and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of questions, right, about how we go forward and do this a little better to avert these safety issues. And I think we have great precedents in a lot of different parts of the inspection and assessment process that we could recycle, reuse, kind of rejigger together to tell us how to move forward. All right, that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.